Imagine waking up to a world where the sun barely shines. A world where daylight looks like an endless, overcast twilight, the sky smeared in a permanent haze. A world where the warmth of summer is stolen, replaced by the icy grip of winter that refuses to end. Now imagine this lasting not for a day, not for a week, but for over a year. This was 536 AD, a year so full of disaster, famine, and death that some historians call it the worst year to be alive. People across the world, from the Roman Empire to China, from the Middle East to the far north of Scandinavia, were thrust into an apocalyptic nightmare. The sun dimmed, the earth grew cold, crops failed, hunger spread, and just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, they did. What followed was a catastrophic volcanic winter, a famine that lasted for years, and a plague that killed millions. Empires collapsed, societies unraveled, people suffered in ways that are almost unimaginable today. This is the story of 536 AD, a year that changed the course of human history forever. It began suddenly. Across the known world, people looked up at the sky and saw something was wrong. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the historian Procopius recorded what he saw. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. It wasn't just the Mediterranean. In China, imperial astronomers wrote of a sky so dark that midday felt like night. Dust rained from above, coating fields and rivers in a strange yellowish ash. In Ireland, monks recorded a terrifying truth: a failure of bread from the year 536 to 539. People were terrified. In an age where the heavens were seen as the will of the gods, the darkening of the sun was an omen of doom. Priests and shamans across the world scrambled to make sense of it. In Rome, citizens flocked to churches, confessing their sins, believing the apocalypse had begun. In Scandinavia, the Norse people sacrificed livestock and even humans, hoping to bring back the light. In China, the emperor's court conducted elaborate ceremonies, praying to the heavens to lift the darkness. But the sun did not return, and as the world grew darker, it also grew colder. For centuries, historians could only guess at what caused this catastrophe, but modern science has given us an answer. Ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica tell us that something massive happened in 536 AD, something that filled the sky with sulfur and ash, blocking out the sun across the world. The cause? A supervolcanic eruption. Researchers believe one of two massive volcanoes erupted Iceland. A cataclysmic eruption sent ash into the stratosphere, spreading across Europe and beyond. Ilopango in Central America, an eruption so powerful that it left a massive crater lake in El Salvador. Whichever one it was, the effect was devastating. With sunlight barely reaching the ground, global temperatures plummeted by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. This may not sound like much, but it was enough to throw the world into chaos. In China, summer temperatures dropped so low that it snowed in August. Farmers stood in their fields, staring in horror at frost-covered crops that should have been growing under the warmth of the sun. In Mesopotamia, once a cradle of civilization, rivers froze solid, an unheard-of phenomenon in the warm lands of the Middle East. In Scandinavia, entire communities froze to death, their bodies found huddled together in homes they could no longer heat. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, people began to realize the terrifying truth. Winter was no longer a season, it was now permanent. The Great Famine, the slow death of millions. With the world trapped in a volcanic winter, food supplies collapsed. Crops need sunlight to grow. Without it, fields lay barren, fruit trees bore no harvest, and pastures withered into dust. In Ireland, monks recorded 3 consecutive years of crop failure. In Italy, people dug through garbage, eating roots, tree bark, and even dirt just to survive. In Scandinavia, entire villages disappeared, not because they moved, but because they died. Then came the unthinkable: cannibalism. In France, skeletal remains from this period show signs of butchering on human bones. In Britain, records speak of people killing their own children for food. When famine strikes, society crumbles. Cities became war zones as the weak were killed by the strong. Markets collapsed and governments could no longer provide for their people. It was not just a famine, it was the slow, agonizing death of millions. And then disease arrived. The Justinian plague, a second apocalypse. Just when the world thought it could suffer no more, a second disaster struck. In 541 AD, barely 5 years after the volcanic winter began, a new horror emerged, one even deadlier than famine, the Justinian plague. This was the first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague, the same disease that would later return as the Black Death in the 14th century. The plague originated in Egypt, spread by rats infested with fleas. These fleas carried the deadly Yersinia pestis bacteria, which soon swept across Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. People fell violently ill. Their bodies swelled with black boils, filled with pus. Victims bled from their mouths and eyes, convulsed in agony, and died within days. At its peak, 5,000 people per day were dying in Constantinople alone. Emperor Justinian I himself caught the disease, though he miraculously survived. But his empire never recovered. By the time the plague ended, over 50 million people were dead. For thousands of years, human civilizations have risen and fallen. Some empires collapsed because of war, some because of corruption and internal strife. But rarely, so rarely, do we see a time when multiple civilizations across the world crumble simultaneously under the weight of an environmental catastrophe. This is what happened in the wake of 536 AD. For 5 long years, the world had endured darkness, famine, and disease. The sun had dimmed and the earth had frozen. Food supplies had failed, and mass starvation had left entire populations weakened. And then, in 541 AD, the Justinian plague arrived, killing millions more. The combined impact of these disasters destabilized societies on a massive scale. Governments that had once seemed invincible suddenly found themselves unable to maintain control. Cities that had flourished for centuries emptied as people fled to the countryside in search of food. Trade routes collapsed, entire cultures vanished. This was not just a crisis, it was a reset of world history. At the start of the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, was at the height of its power. The great Emperor Justinian I had ambitious plans to rebuild the glory of Rome, expanding his empire across the Mediterranean. Under his rule, massive infrastructure projects were undertaken. The Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest architectural wonders of all time, was completed. Laws were reformed under the Justinian Code, bringing stability to the empire. And in a series of successful military campaigns, his general Belisarius had reconquered parts of Italy, North Africa, and Spain, reuniting much of the former Roman Empire. But then came 536 AD. The volcanic winter devastated agriculture. Harvests failed and food prices skyrocketed. The streets of Constantinople, once filled with wealth and prosperity, became overrun with starving refugees. The empire's economy, once one of the strongest in the world, began to collapse. Then, in 541 AD, came the Justinian plague, a disaster so immense that it killed between 25 and 50 million people, wiping out half the population of Byzantium. At the height of the outbreak, 5,000 people died per day in Constantinople alone. Corpses were stacked in the streets, too many to bury. The stench of death filled the city. Even Justinian himself fell ill. He survived, but the empire did not. With millions dead, the army could no longer defend its borders. The empire was weakened right when its enemies were gaining strength. In the following decades, the Persians launched massive invasions, pushing deep into Byzantine lands. The Lombards invaded Italy, taking over large parts of the Italian peninsula. The empire's reconquests in the west collapsed, leaving Rome and its surroundings in permanent ruin. Instead of rebuilding the glory of Rome, Justinian's dream had been shattered, and it all began with 536 AD. To the east of the Byzantine Empire stood the Sasanian Empire of Persia, Byzantium's great rival. The Sasanians, ruling over a vast and powerful empire, had spent centuries fighting Rome and Byzantium for dominance. Their capital, Ctesiphon, was one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world. Their armies were strong, their trade routes wealthy. But just like Byzantium, the Sasanians could not escape the wrath of 536 AD. When the volcanic winter struck, Persia's agricultural lands withered. The fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia became barren. Farmers, unable to grow crops, abandoned their fields, leading to widespread famine. As the empire weakened, rebellions broke out. As the people starved, the government lost control. And then, in 541 AD, the Justinian plague arrived. Just as in Byzantium, it ripped through Persian cities, killing millions. The empire's mighty armies, once feared across the world, were left crippled by disease and starvation. This moment of weakness would cost the Sasanians everything. Just a few decades later, in the early 7th century, a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam. The newly unified Arab-Muslim armies, led by the Rashidun Caliphate, invaded Persia. And with the Sasanian Empire still weakened from the disasters of 536 AD, it collapsed entirely. One of the greatest empires of the ancient world was erased. Meanwhile, in India, another mighty empire was falling apart. For centuries, the Gupta Empire had ruled over northern India, bringing a golden age of science, mathematics, and culture. It was during this time that Indian scholars developed the concept of zero, made advancements in astronomy, and built some of the greatest universities in the world. But then came the disasters of 536 AD. The volcanic winter devastated Indian agriculture. With harvests failing year after year, the empire's economy collapsed. The once thriving cities became ghost towns as starving populations fled into the countryside. At the same time, raiders and invaders saw an opportunity. The Hunas, or Huns, a fierce nomadic people from Central Asia, attacked Gupta territory, raiding and pillaging as they went. The weakened empire could not defend itself. By the end of the 6th century, the Gupta Empire had completely collapsed, throwing India into centuries of political fragmentation. While empires fell in the south, something equally catastrophic was happening in Scandinavia. Unlike the great civilizations of the Mediterranean or the Middle East, the people of Scandinavia depended entirely on small-scale farming and herding. They grew barley and rye, raised livestock, and relied on the land to survive. So when the sun disappeared in 536 AD, they had no backup plan. The climate in northern Europe became brutally cold. Crops failed, animals froze to death. Entire villages were abandoned as survivors fled south in desperation. Archaeologists today find empty settlements dating to this exact period. Something terrible happened. So terrible that half of the population of Scandinavia may have died. Some scholars even believe that this disaster shaped Norse mythology. The Fimbulwinter, a legendary great winter that precedes the end of the world in Norse mythology, sounds eerily similar to the volcanic winter of 536 AD. For the people of the north, the world had already ended. The long road to recovery. It took over a century for the world to recover. By 600 AD, the sun had fully returned, but the damage had been done. 536 AD was the worst year in human history, a time of a darkened sun, a frozen earth, global starvation, a deadly plague, the collapse of empires, and yet, through all of it, humanity survived. Because even in our darkest moments, we endure.